Garrett. James Garrett didn't know Vincent D'Addario, and when I contacted him this spring about doing the talk, though he embraced it very enthusiastically. He is an experienced and gifted photographer, a published photographer. He teaches the history of photography, photographic archives, and visual information at Simmons University and through a variety of workshops. He is published in this field, and until recently was the digital projects lead at Mount Holyoke College. So, thank you for coming.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Eileen, who I think deserves a round of applause. Just for inviting me here today to really celebrate Vinny's photographs and the legacy that he created. I'd also like to thank Anita and her family for supporting this event, along with all of his friends and coworkers that are here today. And thank you all of you for coming out and to take a chance to really learn more about reading photography and looking at Vinny's work and see what it means in the kind of the scope of the history of photography. And just kind of starting as a preamble to my talk, like Anita said, I never had the honor of meeting Vincent, but I did know Vinny through this stamp. And when I was working at Mount Holyoke, I would digitize many photographs from the archives, and anything from the 1960s I would see really stood above the others that had this stamp on it. They were just really clear, concise, beautiful compositions. And so then a few months ago, Eileen approached me to talk to you about Vinny, and I started putting two and two together that the Vinny that she was asking me to talk about was the Vinny that I've been looking at for the past 13 years. So as I began to research his work and going into this vast archives that is really overwhelming, I began to realize what a complete photographer he was. He, and what I mean complete, just of covering every genre of photography. So over the course of my 30 years of working with photographers, assisting and printing for them and doing research, I never met another photographer that covered so much of the field. Most photographers will kind of concentrate on maybe 2 or 3 specific areas in the industry. For example, like education, architecture, commercial photography, politics, photojournalism, weddings, studio portraiture, environmental portraiture, sports, medical, or landscape. And as I was looking through his photographs, his work covered, if not all of those, most of those topics. And one thing I do with my students in my photographic archives class to kind of see how big the world of photography is, our first assignment we do is a mind map of the field of photography. We try to brainstorm every possible avenue that photography encompasses. And up on the left here, you really can't see it at all, but up on the left here is all the different genres kind of that I noted. Here are the different processes. Here are the different ways you can promote your photography. Here are all the different equipment. And if you pulled out any of Vinny's negatives, you could probably line it up with multiple areas of here, and he would light up probably 75% of this chart. And I think the way you can really see this is through his awards, and I think the majority of his work would fall into the realm of photojournalism. And he had many awards through the United Press, International, Associated Press, National Press Photographers, Boston Press. He was in Look magazine, and then received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Valley Press Club, as well as photographing many celebrities of his time, the Kennedys, Bob Hope, Muhammad Ali, Richard Nixon, Norman Rockwell, and Martin Luther King. So that's kind of an introduction to my talk. We'll actually start the talk here. If we could see across time. So what I'd like to talk to you today is about the medium of photography and how the work of Vincent D'Addario fits into the tradition of photography's ongoing interpretation of our lives. I believe that we'll learn a lot about Vincent through his passion of photography, what it takes to be a photographer, and how photography has evolved to allow Vinny to create the messages that inspire, enlighten, and entertained his audiences for years. And the tool that Vinny used to portray these messages was the camera. Photography critic and a philosopher named Wilhelm Flusser describes a tool, like the camera, as an extension of the human organ. For example, teeth, fingers, hands, arms, legs, ears, and eyes can all be attributed to an apparatus that can extend the human reach and interact with objects in nature more powerfully than they can do on their own. However, I feel like the camera was not just an extension of Vinny's eyes. It was also an extension of his heart and his mind. The tools he used, the tool of the camera to use visual literacy to convey the emotion and information to his viewers. A little more about photography in general. I'm going to show you a series of images. This is the first photograph ever taken by Nicephore Niepce in 1826. The lunar module landing, World War II, the Great Depression, Civil War, and up to 9/11. So what if you could see across time? Right? Writer, Professor Estelle Jusem wrote about photography's ability to not only freeze the moment, but also to allow us to see across time simultaneously right now. We're in this room and we're looking across from 1826 to the year 2000. She writes, photography juggles time, yet we can only know these shards of time gone by in the present now. The longer we contemplate a photographic image, the longer we stay in the now. It's kind of a form of meditation when you're reading poetry or listening to music or looking at artwork. You're kind of lost in this moment. So that's kind of what she's talking about here. So she goes on to state that perhaps the real measure of a photograph's greatness is that in its presence we experience the priceless relief from mortality. We engage in such things as intense thought that we have a sense of being outside of ourselves for the entirety of a moment. And that's kind of what I'd like you to do today when you're looking at Vinny's work. Kind of get lost in that moment that he created. And when I'm looking at a photographer's work, I kind of feel their presence. I imagine what they're thinking. I can imagine what their intents were, what message they're trying to relay to us. And even as they're recording and capturing something long ago, we can relive those times now. So if we take Estelle's theory of photography's ability to see across time, and we then think about the timeless qualities of what it's like to be a human, throughout history we have been telling the story of humankind through art. We've documented the joys, the hardships of life through centuries. And I think, as you'll see with Vinny's work, he carried on in this same tradition. How he achieved this speaks to the heart and craft of photography. So now I just want to take you on a little bit of a high-level view of what brings us to Vinny's work, the history of photography. And there's a tool called the camera obscura, which really is an extension of the eye that's been known for centuries into ancient Chinese times, Middle Eastern scientists who created a camera obscura. Camera obscura in Latin means a dark room. And what happens is you have a darkened chamber with a pinhole or a lens, and that image is reversed and projected on the opposite side of the wall. Artists were using this through the Renaissance for painting and drawing, and everybody was saying, why can't we just freeze this beautiful image on the back of the box? Well, there was a long procession that led us to that, but there were two guys that were gentlemen scientists in the 1800s that simultaneously are attributed for inventing photography. One is Louis Daguerre, who is from France, And his announcement was prior to Fox Talbot. There's a little controversy there, and Fox Talbot was in England. And there's a third person that I think is really important that never gets talked about. His name is Sir John Herschel. What he discovered was sodium thiosulfate, which fixes a photograph. Before Herschel, the photographs kept going black. And we needed his invention or his discovery to give to both Daguerre and Talbot to proceed with photography as we know it. So Daguerre won out immediately. His images were, they were small portals, small, crisp daguerreotypes that was on a highly polished piece of copper, coated with silver, and then developed with mercury fumes. It was a very slow, long process, but they were really beautiful, and they were sharp, and it felt like reality at that time, like people were looking into another window. This is the first photograph of a person ever recorded, and those photographs were very long exposures, about 20 minutes when they first started out. This guy on a busy street in Paris was getting his shoe shine, so he happened to stay still long enough to be recorded. So it's, before this, Daguerre was experimenting with sculptures and paper and things like that. So it was the first record of a human. And that being said, you think Vinny carried a lot of equipment, flashes and stands and things. Back then, you couldn't move for about a minute exposure. You had to sit still all that time. So there are these contraptions that people hold their head still. And, yeah. So on the other side of the English Channel, we have Fox Talbot, and he took a different path. He loved to draw in nature, and he used a tool called the camera lucida that he could look down into and see the horizon in front of him and draw at the same time. But he was really bad at it. So he thought, I need to make better landscape pictures. So he started experimenting with the camera obscura, sensitizing paper. And he came up with the Talbot type. They tend to name their processes after themselves at that time period. But Talbot, his images were they were on paper. So they weren't sharp and crisp. They didn't have that the reality that Daguerre had. They were very painterly. But the real advantage of Talbot was he had a negative. He had a piece of paper that he could put in contact with another piece of paper and make multiple prints, where Daguerre's was a one-of-a-kind original, that was it. Talbot will go on to be the actual winner of this process and be the forerunner of modern film photography. And it wasn't until Frederick Scott Archer in 1851 who discovered that if I could put this silver emulsion, instead of on paper, on something clear, we could have a really crisp image. So he took what was called Collodion, and it was used in wartime. It's a gun cotton, I believe, that they would put into wounds. And he applied it to a piece of glass and sensitized it and developed the wet collodion process. Now what that allowed was us to have the crisp detail of the daguerreotype, and it just made photography really take off at that time period. But as the name suggests, it was a wet process. You needed to carry a darkroom with you. You had to coat the glass, you had to sensitize the glass in dark, load it into the camera, and then shoot it all while the film was wet. At that same time, the advancement of print was improved with albumin printing, which was using egg whites on paper to give a very crisp, clear image. That combined with the collodion negative developed something called the carte de visite, and they were really an explosion into mass production of images. Queen Victoria at that time would take celebrity pictures of her family, and people collected them. They would have them in their parlors, and they would have these visiting cards that you could see views from around the world, celebrities at that time. So you can kind of see the trend moving towards Vinny's work. And then along comes the gelatin emulsion, which allows us to have a dry plate negative. No longer do you need to coat your own negatives. You can buy a box of film, shoot them, take them back to your darkroom, process it. We're moving to cheaper, faster, better quality as the technology advances. And next would be plastic film. They're lightweight, flexible, allowing us to have roll film at that time in the late 1800s, which give us smaller cameras. And you can see the transition here to Vinny's camera with a Hasselblad medium format. So we have the original large format camera, and at that time, the size of the camera was the size of the picture that you had. The pictures were made in contact using the sun. It wasn't until we got into the late 1800s when George Eastman took over a patent and created the first Kodak Box Camera, which was one of the big revolutions in photography. It was really the democratization of photography. People could buy a camera at their pharmacy. It was loaded with film, and they could then do snapshots of their daily lives. They didn't have to go to the studio any longer to have these stiff portraits. They could take pictures of their cats, their dogs, their kids playing in the backyard. And that flexible film then led further on into modern cameras. Now, the next big technical breakthrough that allowed us to get the publishing was the letterpress halftone. Prior to the letterpress, photographs needed an artist to make an etching to be able to publish photographs. It wasn't until the letterpress that then we get the first newspaper photographs in the 1880s. And this is March 4th, 1880 in the New York Daily Graphic that really led to photojournalism in magazines and newspapers. So now just switching over a little bit here to kind of the inspiration of photography that Vinny would have been aware of, and any photographer coming up through his time period. Great photographers like Gordon Parks, Dorothea Lange, and Walker Evans were part of something called the Farm Securities Administration in the 1930s. And the Farm Securities Administration was designed to address agricultural problems and rural poverty during the Great Depression. And they had a special photographic section that was led by an editor named Roy Stryker. And it was intended for public relations, but actually they produced one of the greatest collections documenting photos of the US during that time period. And then another photographer I think about when I see Vinny's work is Arthur Felig, otherwise known as the Great Ouija. He was a crime beat photographer in the 1930s and 40s. He had a radio scanner, or not a scanner, but a police radio, and he would many times arrive to the scene before the actual police arrived. He was a real character, so I can kind of see some similarities to his imagery. And that leads us to photojournalism, which I think is kind of the heart of Vinny's work. And there's three things that need to distinguish photojournalism from the other kinds of work that he did. And those are timeliness, objectivity, and narrative. To be considered photojournalism, the images need to have meaning or context in a recently published record of events. And I think most importantly is objectivity. The situation, the images need to be fair and accurate representation of the events. A journalist cannot be held to the demands of the photographic subject, but rather he or she must be concerned with the producing accurate news for the public. And then narrative, and I think many of Vinny's photographs are a narrative, even just in their own, just one image can be a narrative. But the images combined with other news elements to make facts relatable to the viewer or reader on a cultural level. So photojournalism kind of started in the 1890s with the first roll film cameras, and then especially through war photography. Prior to flexible film cameras, like if you think of the Civil War pictures, they were very staged, but the small cameras allowed photographers to have them at the front lines. Spanish-American War was 1890s, was really known for the Kodak camera documenting that. And then the Leica comes along in the 1930s to make it possible for photographers to really get close, to have accurate control of the camera and a higher quality with smaller format films. And then thinking about World War II, And we just commemorated the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and Robert Capa's image of the invasion here, which is a very famous image. And then Vinny's own brother, Ray, was well known for photographing the Nuremberg trials. And it's interesting, at that time period, when Ray was in service, Vinny actually got to experiment with the cameras that he left behind and became a photographer himself during that time period. So then if we look at the golden age of photojournalism, and it really was from the 1930s and 50s. We have the halftone press, we have flexible film cameras, and then we have Life magazine, which was an oversized, beautiful reproduction, and they built their readerships on the quality of photography in those magazines, which almost every household had during that time period. So I would think that Vinny was looking at these images and aware of it. They hired the best photographers at that time period. Other magazines were like Look magazine and Sports Illustrated, but photographers like Alfred Einstein, Margaret Burke White, Eugene Smith, Gordon Parks, Nina Lean, Richard Avedon, these great photographers were in these weekly publications, and the mass public was being influenced by this great work. So then you go into the 1970s, and there was more of an appreciation for photojournalism. Art galleries were starting to recognize, and museums recognized the work, and many collections were being exhibited up until the current time period. And then with the introduction of digital cameras, photojournalism was greatly augmented by its capacity to report up to the minute news. Now with like a 24-hour news cycle, images can be captured, sent to their editor, and published instantaneously through small newspapers or self-published newsletters, even online. So, after all this, we now have a chance to see the world through Vinny's vision when you go out and take a look at his photographs. You can see what he saw, feel what he felt, and think about the world in front of his camera and how it impacts us at this moment now. A long tradition leads us to his work that was influenced and built on the shoulders of photographic giants. So through the preservation and access of this archive by the Holyoke Public Library, Vinny's work can now continue on by teaching and inspiring us, as well as we can learn from his mastery of the medium of photography. That wraps up this part of the talk. I would like to go on and do a little bit about how to read a photograph and how to look at visual literacy when you give you some tools to look at his work and other photographs. We can do questions at the end, or we could take them now. Maybe we'll just do it at the end. A little bit about how to read a photograph. There's a great photographer named Minor White, and he said to read a photograph is to communicate by the best of one's ability to another person, verbally or written, what one has experienced. And I think that's the key, the experience of photograph. When we look at the context, we look at the content, and we look at the composition. And there's this philosopher and photography, he was mostly a philosopher, and he wrote about photography in this book called The Camera Lucida. And he stated that a good photograph has something called a studium and a punctum. Studium is setting the stage, the background of the photograph, where the photograph was taken. And the punctum is kind of the punctuation. It's that spark, it's that connection, the human connection that's in the photograph. It could be something witty, it could be something tragic. And if you look for those two things in Vinny's work, I think you'll really discover them. When I have my students learn how to describe a photograph, I think those techniques can also be used in just viewing photography. And we can't do this here, but I think the most important thing is to look at the back of a picture. Many times there are so many notes taken, names, dates, places, locations. However, you have to take that at face value, because over time, names can be incorrect, but it's a good starting point. I look at the overall impression of the picture. I kind of divide it into quadrants and look at sections at first and list out mentally what I see in the picture. There's a woman in the upper right corner. There's a dog in the right. The sky is cloudy. Kind of just making observations. And then thinking about why the photo was taken. What was the photographer's intent? And how does the photograph express that information? What is the perspective? What is the photographer trying to show you? A child's perspective? And then also making sure we're not making assumptions when looking at the photograph. If you see a child and a woman, you might think that it's a mother and daughter, but maybe they're not. So trying to be aware that we can be making assumptions when looking at photographs. And then I try to list what things I might infer from the photograph, develop some questions, and then do the research of finding where can I find the answers. And the other interesting thing, when I was looking at Vinny's work, I would look at his contact sheets, and the medium format camera he's shooting with was a square format. And his contact sheets are all square. But have you seen any square pictures at all in this collection? They're all either vertical or horizontal. So what he was doing was shooting really loose with the camera and kind of mentally noting this is going to be a vertical, this is going to be a horizontal. And by having a large format negative, he was then able to crop into his image and pull out the vertical or horizontal. Many journalists during his time period were probably shooting with 35 millimeter, and it's what you had in the frame, where there's one of the emergency room doctor on the wall, and I think I have it in here as well. And it's a really powerful image, but it's much grainier than his other work. And I then was going through his contact sheets, and I saw that that doctor was really tiny in the picture. He zoomed in and was able to know the moment, but because he had a larger format camera, he could then do post-editing to create the image. So I just put that note, square format, to remember to tell you that. So looking at this image, I think about industry. And who knows why he took this picture. It could have been for, it could have been a journalistic image, it could have been a company report on industry. But if you look at, the studium is this background, but the punctum is these two welders at the same time and the sparks flying in opposite direction. And just the mastery of the composition with this ladder coming down in these beautiful circular, and the tone and sharpness of the image. It's kind of a funny image where this image to me develops a lot of questions. Who are these kids? Why are they lost? You know, and this boy is up here telling the police officer, I'm 3 years old. Or looking at the purse here, is it a mom who just had to like go make a phone call or something and said, hey, could you watch my kids for a second? And then I try to look at the details, like in the back here is a fan on a stand, which maybe, you know, there wasn't air conditioning at that time period. They're up high, you can see the roof line across the street. If you looked at the negative, you could maybe see a calendar up here and maybe get a date from that. So there's a lot of clues that you can find in looking at a photograph. With this image, it's really a dramatic image. We have a dramatic sky. We have these beautiful lines in the foreground and this silhouetted structures in the back. It kind of has a foreboding, more dramatic image. So maybe, to me, it could say something about pollution or some industrialization in an area. So it depends what message he was trying to say, but that's what I get from reading it. I'm sorry?
We know some, we're just saying those are rock drills up there.
Oh,
Yeah.
Norman Rockwell?
They're
Rock
No,
drills.
rock drills.
Oh,
Rock drills in that photograph.
oh, okay, okay. And this picture is very evocative. What I see when I look at this is not just the guy pushing the car in his misery, but I also see this window in the background and this trail coming along here. And it has this sense of, is this guy's son who was coming home and got stuck and you can see the light in the window and he had to trudge out here and help, or is it a neighbor? But I get a sense of home, and he's out in the snow and the inclement weather. It's a very dramatic image. And I thought this was kind of a characteristic image as well. He's shooting down low at the child's level, these 2, 3-year-olds, looking up at this towering figure. And what is he holding? But the punctum of this image is kind of, he's sharing this, what is it, cotton candy with this police officer, which is kind of a funny moment. And you see this woman in the background looking on in humor. And then I was wondering, where is this taken? And, you know, looking at the building, it looks like the Big E, possibly. Yeah, and the police officer there.
It's at Eastern States Exposition,
Yes.
where Vinny spent two weeks every year.
Right. So these are a few of my sources, and I hope you can take those lessons in when you look at Vinny's photographs. So, thank you very much.
Questions. Now, before we do, I want to, like a public apology to James here, because I sent him the images as soon as he got on board. I sent him the images that I thought were going to be in the exhibit, but only in the last couple of weeks did I have all the descriptions done, and I wasn't able to share those with him. So that's why he knows a little bit less about some of the photographs. And we have since researched the one with the drills. That is the building of 91 in the Smiths Ferry area. That was taken at Eastern States, and I don't think we know the year. And there was one of the, I'm pretty sure, we don't know, but I'm pretty sure that the one with the welders is Northeast Utilities, because he was a commercial photographer.
Yeah.
Where do we think that Martin Luther King was born?
I know that that was taken at Holyoke, and I was looking through, actually, Mount Holyoke is a part of a 3-college repository system called Compass, and you can, as a public, you can look in there. And you can search Vinny's name, and there has been some description, and his name came up on many of those photographs.
Oh, wow. That's
I'd like to make a comment. Digital photography today, everybody's a photographer, but they're very, very poor at taking pictures because they don't know what to look for. And I grew up with roll film cameras, 645s, and when you had to pay money to process 15 photos, you didn't want to waste 7 shots that weren't good. You'd make sure the shot's good. Yeah. Now people are going, and every one of those are poor pictures.
Yeah, I agree. However, I think as we look through the history of photography, I think wet plate collodion photographers would have said the same thing about dry plate photographers, like, oh, they don't have to coat their images anymore. So I think it's a tool that we can use, and digital makes our lives a lot easier in many ways. However, you're right. There's going to be an easier threshold. People can get in much easier. We have our cell phones.
They don't know how to edit.
And they don't know how to edit, yeah. And who knows where they're going to be. I think one of the important things is preserving your files. When now we have 20,000 negatives preserved here, but what are going to happen to the 20,000 pictures taken in 1 year on one phone? And which ones do you want to save? So it opens up a huge can of worms, but...
You hope for good AI.
I'm sorry?
You gotta hope for good artificial intelligence, because you're so crazy trying to figure out which one to keep.
Right.
Yeah. People aren't printing anything any longer.
That's true.
Families
Print.
get together 30, 40 years later, say, do you have an image? Well, it kind of blew up with the fire of the house, or the iCloud, let it go, and you have nothing.
I agree.
They should print some pictures.
Exactly, and I think that's a great word of wisdom. I think with today's digital publishing, it's easier than ever to make your own books. So at the end of the year, my wife and I will take all of our pictures and make just a photo book that then you can share to all your other family members, and you have a paper copy that can be preserved. So yeah. I love the print, and I think the print is something you can hold, and you can experience, and you can see where the screen is just pixels and light. Great. Well, thank you very much.